Okay, good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm gonna leave this door open. There's also to let some air through, but I think we better keep it open. So try not to shriek or shout or anything like that. Welcome to today's maritime history seminar for tonight's paper, which is special for all sorts of reasons. One of them is to mark some changes that are going on behind the scenes here. I don't know if you know, there's a Laughton naval history unit here. There's also a Corbett Centre at Defence Studies, which is also part of the School of Security Studies. And there's a coming together of these groups. There's not much really to announce about that, apart from just saying, watch this space. There might be more to come. But tonight's lecture is the first taste of it, so hopefully you'll be intrigued about what's coming. It is, of course, and you know this very well, Andrew Lambert's book launch for his latest. I get them down so that I've set the display. But you know full well why you're here to hear about that book. You also have an opportunity to take one of those home with you at a discounted price of just £20. So I'm sure a number of you will want to mark what I'm glad to be told is the anniversary of Waterloo today. So a book on how to avoid such occasions again is just the ticket. But of course, it's more than that. This is a normal maritime history seminar. So I'm going to just speak to the people who are watching at home. We will take your questions if you type them into the chat, you at home. So do that and contact me if there's a technical issue or something by email. So there are people up there, there are people in the room. But for the introduction to that, I'm going to hand over to Professor.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is the fourth iteration of the annual Peter Neville Davis Memorial Lecture. Peter was a huge influence in the development of maritime economic history at the University of Liverpool and in international organisations and in fostering academic partnerships in Japan and various other countries. So it's an absolute pleasure for me to be here tonight to chair this. And tonight it's also an absolute pleasure to introduce the Laughton Professor of Naval History here at King's, Andrew Lambert, who has done a great deal for maritime and naval history, not least by hosting this seminar for over 4 decades at this university. And for that, the maritime history and the naval history community are eternally grateful. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much for those very kind introductions. And it is indeed, as ever, a very great pleasure to be here. I have some people in the room who I need to thank. My editor, Julian Luce, who has stuck with me through thick and thin, well, mostly thick, because they tend to be quite wide books, for some time, and without whom I would doubtless be doing different things at the moment. What I want to talk about is the main theme of the book, which is how Britain transitions from a massive, costly, dangerous warfare state built up over the 20 years of effectively total war against revolutionary and Napoleonic France to a century of limited conflicts, limited commitments, in which the primary political aim is the reduction of the national debt. Does this sound familiar? Which threatened to overwhelm the economic system through simple economic interest payments. This was much easier in the 19th century because there were really only 3 things the government spent money on. The biggest was indeed servicing the national debt. The other 2 were the army and the navy, and they could be cut down pretty dramatically if Britain created, through its diplomacy, through its influence, through its efforts, a European state system that was relatively stable, particularly balanced in Western Europe, and avoided the possibility that France, under a republic, an empire, a monarch, or any other system of government it chose, would break out of its natural boundaries, reacquire what we now know as Belgium, and use the Scheldt estuary as a base to threaten an invasion of the United Kingdom. As Lord Castlereagh explained in the build-up to the Vienna Congress, to allow France to keep Belgium, Antwerp, and the Scheldt would be the equivalent of forcing Britain to maintain a permanent war establishment. And this was economically unaffordable. Please come in. Let's see. There are some, I'm sure, some. So the main theme of No More Napoleons is not necessarily personally avoiding Napoleons, but necessarily avoiding a threat in Western Europe. There is at the same time a similar threat posed by Russia in the east, and the British are equally interested in keeping Russia from intervening in Western Europe, and more particularly from overthrowing the Ottoman Empire, modern Turkey, and marching on India. The last was a nightmare for British soldiers who needed a nightmare to try and increase their spending power. It turns out there wasn't really much of a crisis over this. The Russians and the British had plenty of space in Asia. This is why Lord Castlereagh, as Foreign Secretary, said we must have a two-power naval standard. Our navy must be equal to that of France and Russia combined, just in case. So the navy was maintained on a large scale, but it was not maintained heavily manned. Let's move on. It's critical to understand that the strategic history of England-Britain is dominated by the threat from the near abroad. The first great naval battle in English history, the Battle of Sluis, is fought in a Belgian harbour, now long since filled in. The English invasion fleet met the French invasion fleet in Belgium. It sank the French fleet, wiped out the army on board, and the 100 Years' War was then fought in France, not in England. This is the simple equivalent of the 19th century. The port city of Antwerp, the largest and most important of the economic hubs of Northern Europe in the early modern era, was transformed by Napoleon into a first-class naval base with a large shipyard, dockyard facilities, and other installations. And Napoleon constantly referred to it as a pistol pointed at the heart of England, and he was not joking. It was pointed, but he didn't intend to fire it, because Napoleon understood very well that committing a first-class army to the sea in the face of the Royal Navy would invite not only a first-class disaster, but also the renewal of conflict by his continental enemies. 100,000 drowned French soldiers will lead to a war, and the French might not win that war. Napoleon is using Northwest Europe, and particularly the Scheldt estuary, the one place where you can gather a large invasion force secure against attack from the sea, to hold the British out of Europe. This is a balance which Napoleon uses. He threatens to invade from Boulogne. You can't invade from Boulogne. It's a dry harbour. You can't get enough ships afloat on the tide at Boulogne to invade anything more than a very small island. And everybody knows this. Napoleon is using Boulogne not to invade England, but to assemble very large armies which quickly march from Boulogne to the Battle of Austerlitz, the battles in Prussia in 1807, and indeed in 1812. The army of France sets off from Boulogne. It's the assembly point for the French army for continental, not overseas expeditions. But while that army is sitting in Boulogne, and while the French have a large number of ships available, the threat is real, and much of the British army will be deployed in Britain, manning the defences of the south coast. It's critical to understand that in 1809, the largest expeditions of amphibious power in the entire era is 40,000 British troops landed in the Scheldt estuary near the port of Vlissingen on the island of Walcheren. It's a Dutch harbour. It was the launch point for any possible invasion of England. And those 40,000 troops captured and destroyed Vlissingen. It's a sophisticated naval base with dry docks and other facilities, all of which were destroyed by demolition by the Royal Engineers, which is their main purpose. The main role of the British Army in Northern Europe is to destroy hostile naval bases. It's not a field army. Its job is to conduct grand raid operations and destroy the enemy's ability to operate a fleet. 1809 gets a bad rite in the histories of army operations because nobody got killed, but a lot of men died of disease. This rather misses the point. The strategic impact was very simple. The British Army moved from England to Portugal and Spain. The English gained the initiative in Iberia by moving their army out of England because they were now not worried about an invasion. So these are the logics which I think are important to understand. Napoleon is using Antwerp and other base facilities on the Scheldt estuary to deter Britain from intervening. Of course, Antwerp is right down here. This is the Scheldt estuary. And in modern times, the gateway to the Scheldt is held by the Dutch, not by the Belgians. Only Napoleon, who rules both, is able to control these access points. And this is why the Dutch harbour is destroyed. It is under Napoleonic rule. In 1812, Napoleon's system begins to crack. The Russians refuse to continue the economic counter-blockade of England. Napoleon launches a massive invasion, which ultimately fails. Russia is now an ally of Britain, and quickly Prussia and later Austria will join in a grand coalition to overthrow Napoleon. The British use their money, their influence, and their diplomatic skill to create a concept for an ordered, stable post-war Europe. Belgium, which had been ruled by Austria, will now become part of a united Netherlands with the Dutch Republic, and it will be ruled not by republicans, but by a king, the former Prince of Orange, whose son is about to marry the Crown Princess of England. This doesn't end up happening, but a very close alignment between England and the United Netherlands will guarantee the security of those provinces. It would also be guaranteed by all the other great powers. So the British are using money and influence to create a very favorable strategic situation. And in political science terms, we call this ordering, getting the system to work properly in the build-up phase. What the British do to secure this is to support the ambitions of all the other great powers in parts of Europe that they don't care much about. Mostly, I'm afraid to say, Poland, which was carved up once again by Austria, Prussia, and Russia. The Russians managed to keep the Grand Duchy of Finland, and everybody else was carving up bits of other people's territory. And anything that wasn't seriously strategically interesting to the British, they were horse trading that for this deal. The French, after the overthrow of Napoleon, were persuaded to sign up as well as part of the deal for getting out of the situation they were in. They voted to take their king back, and they were very keen to rejoin the European great power system. So Britain is able to create this system in 1814. As soon as the Napoleonic Wars end with the overthrow of Napoleon, the Duke of Wellington, who is already in France, becomes the ambassador in Paris. And he uses his time there not only to cement the alliance and sign the final act of the Vienna Congress, he also rides through Belgium, organizing the defense of what is now the United Netherlands, rebuilding the old barrier forts of the 18th century, and he inspects some of the key battlefields. Because Belgium, as you know, is packed full of places where people have fought battles. And on his long voyage to India, he read the Duke of Marlborough's journals and was well aware of a place that we know as Waterloo. The Duke of Marlborough had marched in roughly the same direction as Napoleon in 1705, had spotted the battlefield and decided it was a very bad place to attack moving north. He pulled a 5-mile right flank maneuver and outmaneuvered the enemy on the position and secured it without a battle. Marlborough was a much better picker of topographical sites than Napoleon. Napoleon relied on power. Marlborough relied on ground. Wellington is on this ground in September 1814, on horseback with Marlborough's journals, with the Royal Engineers at his side, making notes about this. So when Napoleon comes back, Wellington knows exactly what to do, and he knows exactly where the battle will be fought. The British and the Prussian armies need to come together, and they need to destroy Napoleon's army, not defeat it. They have to destroy it. Wellington has picked a battlefield where he cannot lose unless he does something really stupid, which he never does. He holds the French on the battlefield until the Prussians arrive to deliver the final knockout blow. The British win the battle, the Prussians finish the job. There is no French army on the day after Waterloo. It's collapsed in complete rout. Wellington immediately abandons the military campaign. He gets the old King of France back in his carriage. They rattle down the road to Paris, and Wellington restores the Bourbons for a second time to ensure that the system of Vienna is maintained despite the interruption caused by Napoleon. The city of Antwerp, this is 1832 map. The key things to notice are this double dock here. If you've been to Antwerp, you'll probably have seen this, the Napoleon dock. This is where the great Antwerp Museum is today. And over here is a fortified position where the French were building their battleships. Many in Britain thought the whole of this thing should be blown up. The defences, the dockyards, the shipyards, it should all be destroyed. But Wellington turned up and said, no, this is a waste. These facilities will allow the Belgians to do a lot more business. It will make them rich, and happy people don't have revolutions. So let's have rich Belgians who are content through the expansion of trade using Napoleon's magnificent dock. And it is the beginning of Antwerp as one of the world's great ports. So Wellington allows the defences to be maintained, and he allows the Belgians to keep them. Very smart man, Wellington. Here is Napoleon in 1803 with the Empress Josephine attending the inauguration of a dockyard at Antwerp. This was his grand project, and it was designed to threaten the British. If you look at the dates, this is the period of peace between the two powers that Napoleon is preparing for the next war. The artist is Belgian, and he will paint other images. This is a later one, May 1810, battleship Friedland going into the sea, viewed not by the Empress Josephine, but by the Empress Marie-Louise. Napoleon has upgraded his marital situation. He's building 5 or 6 battleships every year on the Scheldt estuary to simply overwhelm British. The collapse of his empire in 1813-14 means that Belgium falls into British hands. The British send a small army. They don't capture the province, they just pick it up when the French abandon it. It is a very Please come in. It is a very easy operation for a relatively small force of regulars. And here we see them marching through the Great Square in the centre of Antwerp. And again, it's the same Belgian artist. Situation changes, artist works for different patrons. Battle of Waterloo. Always seen as a grand military spectacle, it is much more important as the capstone on Britain's ordering of Western Europe. The Anglo-Prussian alignment, the link between Britain and Hanover, which is still ruled by the English king until 1837, and the United Netherlands, means that the French will not be able to advance into the Low Countries and secure those bases ever again. One of the things the British do in 1815 is move the boundaries of Prussia, Hanover, and the Dutch state to make it possible for Hanoverian troops to march straight from Hanover into Holland and on into Belgium. So there's a little bit of strategic adjustment going on as well. So forget all of the blood and glory, think about the strategic context. Wellington waits and waits because he knows that he needs to apply a killing stroke to the French. He doesn't need to win, he needs to win big. Wellington remains in Paris and as the commander-in-chief of the Army of Occupation, as well as the British ambassador, and he pushes post-war defence cuts because the system is working. The best way to avoid a total war is to run down the national debt and build up the reserves and increase economic activity. Spending money on defence post-1815 would be a bad thing to do. But at the same time, he is working on a programme of sustained structural changes to the geography of Britain that will enable Britain to be more effective in defending itself, more effective in dispatching expeditionary forces, and maintain the ultimate requirement, which is command of the sea. So what we see is the introduction of steam-powered shipping, more reliable movement at sea. We then see a whole series of massive artificial harbour projects, one in France and at least 4 big ones in Britain. If you've been through Dover, you will have been through a Wellington harbour. It was the Duke who pushed that project right to the end. The great harbour at Portland, also built under the aegis of Duke of Wellington as a base for a fleet to control trade along the south coast of England. And the Anglo-German link that was forged at Waterloo endured for at least half a century. And of course, the great image in the House of Lords is Wellington winning at Waterloo, Nelson winning at Trafalgar, and the two have to be seen together. When Wellington died, the Prussians sent a very large delegation to attend his funeral. And while they were here, they checked out just how good the British Army was, just in case they needed it. Because in 1840, there's a great crisis in the Far East, so-called Muhammad Ali crisis. The Egyptians have attacked the Ottoman Empire, the French are backing them, the other great powers are opposing them. The King of France, flustered by the failure of his allies, suggests that he might cross the Rhine and invade Germany. On the same day, the King of Prussia gives Wellington command of the Prussian army. This is November 1840. This comes through the diplomatic channels. It is immediately accepted by the Duke. But by the time that message gets back to Berlin, the French have backed out and given up. Wellington comes within an ace of having to do Waterloo all over again in 1841. That's the basis of British security. In 1814, the Tsar of Russia is also playing to be the great European organizer. In April 1814, the Russian army has a massive display on the Champ de Mars in Paris, 120,000 troops, horse and foot and artillery, a display of power unrivaled by any of the other contemporary armies. That's a space under the Eiffel Tower these days. The British immediately stage an enormous fleet review of Spithead, and they invite the Tsar and the King of Prussia and the Chief Austrian Minister to come along and see what power really looks like. The fleet maneuvers in the space between Portsmouth and the Isle of Wight. Many of the ships on display are either captured foreign vessels or named after captured foreign vessels, just to make the point that the Royal Navy increases its scale in wartime by capture, and that the balance of advantage is massive. One of the flagships is called the Ville de Paris, in honor of a flagship captured in 1782 from the French. The Tsar is horrified. He's profoundly seasick to start with. The spectacle of Britain's wealth, power, and industrial output is truly shocking. He is taken into the dockyard to see Samuel Bentham's rigging block machine tools. The mass production of interchangeable part goods for the first time ever is happening in Portsmouth dockyard in its rigging blocks. And once the Tsar understands what this means, his mood sours. And just at that point, Wellington turns up on leave from Paris to demonstrate what a real hero looks like in the action British. And this is 1814, not 1815. The last thing the Tsar sees in London before he goes home is the launch of HMS Nelson, the world's biggest battleship at Woolwich. This is all carefully stage managed, and it does impress, and it does have an effect. The Russians are not going to be a problem, and it looks like the French probably won't be either. Of course, Napoleon, having lost Antwerp and the Scheldt estuary, needs another base to threaten the English from. So he picks up Louis XVI's great project at Cherbourg to build an immense artificial harbour, the first great artificial harbour project in Western Europe. Here he is with Marie-Louise attending a parade of the squadron on the incomplete works. And this project, Cherbourg, on an immense scale, will be the litmus test of French political ambition in the 19th century. Every French regime, and there are many, will leave their name on bits of this work. There's a huge artificial breakwater. There are massive dry docks. There are workshops. There are floating basins. And they read like the political history of France. Every regime puts their name on it, and every regime claims the credit. Charles X was there during the reign of his elder brother in the 1780s and always remembered it. And the last thing that happened for Charles X before the French Revolution of 1830 was that he named a basin after himself. Shortly afterwards, he used it to flee to England. He was succeeded by Louis Philippe, his cousin, who was a great fan of war art, and we will see this later. But each French regime feels compelled to finish this grandiose project, and the British feel compelled to anticipate the consequences. 1815, Royal Academy show, which is literally 20 yards that way in Somerset House. This is the star picture, Turner's Dido built in Carthage, painted in 1814 to celebrate the defeat of Napoleon by the people Napoleon called the Carthaginians. Napoleon's favourite insult for the English was either shopkeeper or Carthaginian. And Turner is saying very politely, we are the Carthaginians and we did win this time. The sea power states do win. The imperial contest has been decided in our favour. This is the greatest picture in the National Gallery because it was painted for the nation by its greatest artist. It was not purchased, it was donated. So if you ever thought J.M.W. Turner was a skinflint, he wasn't. He had things which he thought were important. It still hangs exactly where he required it to be hung. The British quickly get back to normal business, which is using naval power to secure political, economic, or other advantage. 1816, the Algerines start pirating and enslaving European seafarers, mostly Sicilians. The English tell them not to, they ignore them, so their fleet is destroyed and their cities bombarded, and they behave themselves for some time after this. This is a very old-fashioned attack. They get in very close, so they can't miss. They fire lots of rounds, they do a lot of damage. But things will change. The Royal Navy needs the ability to project power from the sea without getting within gun range of the enemy. One of the techniques they will use is the one used in the bombardment of Baltimore in the Anglo-American War of 1812, that firing mortars and rockets. You know the line, the rocket's red glare, the bombs in the air. Those are mortar shells being fired from British mortar vessels offshore and rockets fired from boats closer in. Those weapons will be improved and become more accurate and more powerful. By the mid-century, they hold the key to destroying hostile naval bases without landing troops. In 1830, a new establishment is created at Portsmouth, HMS Excellent. It's a very old wooden battleship. It's now the gunnery school, and that's where they're going to develop new, longer range, more accurate guns, and they're going to train a generation of officers and naval ratings to use them to effect to bombard distant positions. This is transformational. In Nelson's day, a ship would not engage a fort because the fort would always shoot more accurately. By 1835, by 1840, ships are firing at least as accurately as fort because they have mastered the problems of firing from a moving platform. Men like Thomas Hastings make a huge contribution here, endless practice, working out how to design better artillery and better methods. Hastings was driven on by an interesting experience he had in 1814. He was the first lieutenant of the frigate that took Napoleon to Elba. And Napoleon, as was often the case, spent almost the entire voyage talking about himself and his plans, which included invading England. So Hastings and his successors were well aware of the importance of what they were doing. Range and precision were going to be vital. And by the early 1850s, the Royal Navy's artillery was longer ranged and more precise than that of any other nation. The British were the first to introduce rifled artillery. 1840, in the Muhammad Ali crisis, the Egyptians have captured the great fortress of Acre, and they need to be removed from there pretty quickly. So an Anglo-Austrian Ottoman formation bombards the two seaward flanks of the position, facing south and west. And in a matter of 2 hours, they overwhelm the Egyptian gunners, who are French trained. They demolish most of the fixed defenses. And a shell fired from one of the steam vessels, possibly one seen here in the foreground, sets off the main Egyptian magazine, which blows up the center of the city and persuades the Egyptians to abandon the position and flee across the desert back to Egypt. This is a demonstration of precision gunnery. Many of the officers involved have been trained at excellent, and many of them note in their journal just how accurate their guns were. They were laying individual 32-pounder guns to knock out specific weapons on the walls of Acre, and in some cases to kill specific gunners who were still firing back at them. Several officers note this, and they relate it to this transformational moment when accuracy becomes more important than volume. The men who star in this operation will go on to serve in other wars. At the same time, the French are making it apparent that they do intend to do something aggressive at some stage in the future. Louis Philippe, king from 1830 to 1848, turns the derelict palace of Versailles into a grand gallery of battles. Every battle the French have fought since Charlemagne disrupted the Moors at Roncesvalles, all the way through to the work of his sons trying to capture and conquer Algeria. There's a sort of bookend here. French soldiers fighting Muslims from North Africa. It's kind of constant. And the pictures get bigger and bigger. By the end, in 1848, when Louis Philippe is overthrown and removed, they have a picture 24 meters long and 5 meters high of a cavalry raid on a small encampment. It's only important because one of Louis Philippe's many sons took command of the operation. They didn't even secure the mission. It's a spectacular cover-up for complete failure. Here is Louis Philippe standing right in the middle, and he's assembled the diplomatic corps of Europe to show them his gallery of battles. And most of these diplomats are just the right age to have served in the army during the Napoleonic Wars on the other side. And here's a battle picture which will show them all something of their country getting beaten by the French. This is not good PR. It's not good international relations. And it does persuade the English that the French are endlessly aggressive, endlessly ambitious, and they certainly have to be watched. One of the British delegates is a close friend of Wellington, former soldier, and he says there's a picture of a French ship capturing a British ship. He said, if we had pictures of all of the times we'd ever done that, there wouldn't be buildings in the world enough to hold them all. This is ridiculous. So this project is all part of an obsession in France with glory, victory, triumph. And each successive French regime is convinced that the way to become stable and popular and get everybody on your side is to be like Napoleon. Most of the people of France, A, don't have a vote, and B, couldn't care less. What they don't want to do is pay more taxes and see their sons taken away to be killed in war. The French peasantry had no interest in war and glory. They want to till their fields and make some money. This is very wise. So you get an endless turnover of French regimes. Most of these French regimes are overthrown by a crowd in Paris, which is unenfranchised, somewhat left of centre, but certainly not interested in crossing the Rhine or indeed invading anywhere. So the French political failure is creating tension in Europe, which could have been avoided. Here is the offending picture that Wellington's friend noted. The French corvette Bayonnaise captured a small British frigate, the Ambuscade, and Napoleon was so surprised to hear of this that he commissioned the picture from Louis-Philippe Crepin, and he kept it in his apartment. This was one of Napoleon's favorite pictures. It is a brilliant piece of work. The original drawings and the work itself are of a very high quality, completely wasted on the subject. Crepin would go on to be the painter to the Marine, to French royalty, down to the end of his professional career. The French could certainly paint a good naval battle, but that's about as far as it went. This was more normal. This is Baron Gross's picture of the Battle of Eylau, 1807. It's out in Prussia. The French are fighting the Russians and the Prussians in the snow. It's a really nasty place to be. And here is Napoleon, and he commissioned this picture. It's enormous. It hangs next to the raft of the Medusa, and he is both the war hero and the redeemer. His ambitions are astonishing. And there's a figure which I'd invite you to consider. Right here is an unfortunate man who is both dead and frozen solid. If you look at J.M.W. Turner's great picture of Trafalgar, you will find this quoted in the foreground of the picture. This man upside down with his staring eyes peering out of, and Turner had seen this picture in Paris. It was in the Louvre. It was on public display. So Napoleon's grandeur was countered by Turner's grandeur. And I think of the two, the Turner is a greater picture. This is all very well. Here is the gallery of battles today, still packed full of long forgotten French heroes and long forgotten skirmishes in North Africa with the indigenous people. A lot of money was pushed into this by a very rich man, did him no favors. In 1850, Thomas Hastings handed over command of the Excellent to Sir Henry Chadd, and he took the idea of demolishing Cherbourg from the sea to a new level. Chadd had an interesting war. He was the first lieutenant of HMS Java when it was captured by the USS Constitution in 1812. It's a lesson he didn't forget. A bigger ship with bigger guns defeated the ship he was on, despite his best efforts. And he would take the Royal Navy's offensive strategy to war in 1854 with the French, not against them. Here we are at Bomarsund in the Åland Islands, halfway between Sweden and Finland, at the neck of the Gulf of Bothnia. And here is Henry Chadd. Here's the French Admiral, Constable de Chaines. Here is the British Admiral, Sir Charles Napier, straw hat. And here is the Chief of Staff, Admiral Sir Michael Seymour. So we have 4 admirals on the quarterdeck of a small British frigate, watching a 68-pounder gun firing at 3,000 yards range, that's part of 2 miles, and hitting the target over and over again. This is unprecedented, and it would have astonished Napoleonic veterans like Charles Napier that so much precision had been achieved with smooth bore artillery. This gunnery display is part of how the Crimean War is resolved. The Russians simply do not have the ability to fire at that range, so they don't fire back. It would be a waste of ammunition. In 1855, the great fortress of Cherbourg outside Helsinki is destroyed in a 48-hour continuous bombardment by shell fire and guns, rockets, and mortar vessels. This is an eyewitness account. Wilson Carmichael was with the fleet, and the large explosion is the main magazine in the Russian fortress exploding. Not a single Allied seafarer lost his life in the course of this battle. It was entirely one-sided. The Russians stopped firing after about an hour because they couldn't reach the vessels that they were firing at. This led the British to commission the construction of a very large force, over 250 steam-powered gunboats, mortar vessels, and other equipment, which they publicly paraded as a threat to St. Petersburg, the capital of Russia. And this persuaded the Russians that it was probably high time they made peace at the end of the so-called Crimean War. Destroying the Russian economy and threatening St. Petersburg is a lot better than capturing Sevastopol if you want to get the attention of the Russian leadership. Still is. Out in the Crimea, everybody gets obsessed with what the army did in the Crimean campaign. This is what the whole campaign was about. The Russians had a very large, brand new dockyard at Sevastopol to maintain their fleet in the Black Sea, 6 huge dry docks. The British knew all about them because British engineers had built them, and British engineering companies had provided most of the pumping and other equipment. So as soon as they got control of the city, the Royal Engineers took a very long-term approach. They spent nearly 6 months blowing up the entire dockyard complex. The thing to notice here is not the Royal Engineers drilling in under the dockyard floor, it's the French officers here working out that the British are planning to do this at Cherbourg as well. George's Day, 1856, Grand Parade of the Baltic Fleet for that year, which never got sent. Royal Review, the gunboats bombarding South Sea Castle with blanks, fortunately. A massive demonstration of how the British won the Crimean War. Not a single soldier to be seen anywhere. This is sea power triumphant. The Queen blesses it all, and the assembled diplomatic corps is advised not to mess with the British. And the Times says a new way of waging war from the sea has been invented. We can now carry the power of the sea deep inland using these small, agile craft. This should have been the end of French plans for aggression, but it wasn't. Here is Cherbourg, pictured in 1858 by a British lithographer. Your position is bird's eye out at sea, looking at the great breakwater and then the great dockyard complex behind, with a very large assembly of French ships in the harbour, probably more than we're ever seeing. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who was the next, and indeed the last Napoleon, was convinced that he could persuade the English to back him in a project to reorder Europe along lines that would suit the French. He would keep Italy divided into three separate regimes, Germany split and Russia out. He would encourage the rising of Poland to create an ally in the East. It was all very Napoleon revived. So in August 1858, he invited Victoria and Albert and a whole British delegation to come to Cherbourg and to see his mighty works. It's like Ozymandias, look upon my works, and mighty and tremble. The English were meant to have come and bowed down and said, okay, you are the master of the universe, we will do as you say. It turned out Albert and Victoria had been 6 months earlier and weren't hugely impressed. When they arrived, they brought some Royal Engineer officers with them who took photographs and made some accurate drawings. The British already had the depths of water in Cherbourg, they knew the range, and this great breakwater here is brilliant, because if you know how long it is, that's your geometric base for estimating the range you need to fire at. So the French have even given you a 12-inch rule to help you bombard the place. It was all meant to end in a grand meeting where Albert and Victoria would go aboard the French flagship Lambert, and they would agree. And Britain and France would lead a grand liberal pro-French agenda, which would see Europe rebuilt along lines that Napoleon I might have approved of. This was never going to happen. The British government of 14th Earl of Derby, Conservative ministry, was quite happy for the British delegation to go. A lot of men from the House of Commons, many of them have been already. The Royal Yacht Squadron knew Cherbourg inside out because that's where they bought their cheap booze. And they often took Royal Navy officers with them. The hydrographer of the Navy knew precisely the rise and fall of tide in this region, because that had been a major science project for the British state in this period. They were absolutely ready to do this job. So when Napoleon invites Albert and Victoria on board, they're not willing. These pictures were taken by the great French photographer Gustave Le Gray. This is the British squadron at Cherbourg, part of a series of souvenir postcards which Victoria purchased personally, and they're still in the Royal Archives, as are her drawings of Cherbourg, which are quite good, and those of the Royal Engineer officers who were in charge of the education of her younger sons. They spent the entire period checking the depth, checking the scale of the fortifications, and working out exactly how they would do the job. They were not in the least perplexed by this. Everything had been coming up to a point. This was the point of post-war diplomacy. And here is La Bretonne being visited by the royal couple. And when Albert explains to Louis Napoleon, and he has to explain to him in German because that's the first language of both of them, Louis Napoleon's first language is German. He grew up in German-speaking Switzerland. So his most important conversations are not in French. Albert explains very calmly that the English don't do prescriptive, preemptive reordering. They meet crises on a case-by-case basis, that there is no possibility that this will end. The British then leave before Napoleon unveils the rest of his demonstration. Here's my fleet, here's my naval base. Oh, and by the way, I've got a mainline railway back to Paris to bring troops up. And there's an enormous equestrian statue of Napoleon I in the middle of Cherbourg, pointing at Portsmouth. Diplomatically, they decided not to go and look at these things, because if you haven't seen them, you can't be deterred by them. The picture, as you might imagine, is French, but it ended up in a British collection. This is the high watermark of the middle of the century. A decade later, the Royal Navy goes back to Cherbourg, but there's nothing to see and not much to do. The big ship in the middle is the same one, La Bretonne, but now it's not an ocean-going battleship. It's a hulk for training purposes. It's had its engines removed and it's full of cadets. French sea power has evaporated. Louis Napoleon gives up on his naval ambitions. He stops challenging the British. He's desperate to find some grand gesture that will cement his rule. It doesn't come. he picks a fight with the Prussians, which is not very clever. Because the fight with the Prussians reminds the British that the real danger from the French is that they will march into Belgium, seize Antwerp, take the Scheldt estuary, and pose a strategic threat. So, when the crisis of the Franco-Prussian War begins, the British government, led by William Ewart Gladstone, a great fan of disarmament and low defence spending, mobilises 50,000 troops, half of them Royal Marines, a large naval squadron, and sends a diplomatic note to Paris and Berlin, which says, if you cross the Belgian border, we will be at war with you. We will not be the allies of the other lot. We will just be at war with you. At the same time, they order some small coast service battleships, like the Cyclops here, which are purpose-built to defend Antwerp. The Belgians provided all the details of the depth of water and the nature of the role, and these ships were built to support Antwerp. They were also built to attack Kronstadt, because British sea power was really quite ubiquitous. You could move it around the world and you could threaten many different countries. How the British managed this is really very interesting. Wellington, for example, in 1852, within a week of before he dies, sets up a new paid militia, which means that the tiny British army can be sent to the Crimea in 1854 because the militia have replaced it. And this leads to an increase in reserve formations across the rest of the century, leading to the expeditionary force of 1907, again, backed up by reserve formations. So the defensive role would be for reservists, offensive roles would be for the regulars. And everybody assumed that the role of the British Expeditionary Force in the event of a war in Western Europe would be to secure Antwerp. That is, apart from the British cabinet, who'd completely forgotten what Gladstone had done in 1870, despite being of the same party. Many of them had begun their careers under his premiership, and one of them, John Morley, had actually written the official life of Gladstone, which has all the information you need to understand how to respond to the 1914 crisis. British government made a complete and absolute mess of this. They allowed the army to wander off and behave like a French or German army rather than operating as a British army. And those strategic harbours, well, they just keep on giving. Dover, of course, was always going to be a major commercial connection point, but in both the First and Second World Wars, it was also a massively important strategic base. And this photograph is taken from the Western Heights, the immense system of defences that prevent an invading army getting around the back of Dover and capturing it. Portland is even bigger. The artificial harbour at Holyhead is tremendous. And the great harbour at Dunleary, if you're going to Dublin, was built to speed communications between London and Dublin. This meant that the British government could move reserve troops between the islands much more rapidly using steam shipping and improved harbours. Even the harbour at Harwich, which is critical to blockading the Dutch-Belgian coast, was improved in the 1840s. So massive strategic engineering to increase the ability of the state to operate. The professionalization of all military forces, use of advanced technologies and advanced methods to enable Britain to function more effectively in key areas. And the proof of the pudding is not the Crimean War, it's the Crimean War everybody has forgotten. The bit that doesn't involve rather messy infantry battles, siege operations, the bit that involves blowing up Russian dockyards. By the end of the war, 2 of Russia's 3 most important dockyards have been destroyed. The Russian Navy did not recover for the next 25 years. This enabled Britain to concentrate on Western Europe. The collapse of France in 1870, setting up the Third Republic, means that Britain has no dangerous enemies. So in order to have a dangerous enemy, they make out that the Americans are coming, because that's the only way to keep the estimates up. Be very careful. When soldiers and sailors tell you there's a threat, it usually means they don't have a threat, but they'd like some more money, please. And they are still saying this to this day because nothing changes. No more Napoleons? Well, there was another Napoleon, but he was removed much more easily for the British than the original one because they had better systems in place and better organization to deliver it. Thank you very much.